And happy Wednesday morning. So this is a recording for anyone who might want to watch it later, or instead of joining on the Wednesday afternoon, access a recording of our session. And as always, with our weekly meetings, this meeting is focusing on going through the most important points of the chapter material, provide you a quick crash course on what you should take away from this week. You do have full lecture videos available on your Canvas course, as you have also the face-to-face classes where we go through the lecture material as well. And let's just put ourselves a little oriented of what we are focusing this week. So our focus will be on the lymphatic and immune systems, and these are two systems that really go hand in hand together. We will be first tackling the lymphatic system with few of the important points that relate to that, and then browse through the immune system. We will probably spend a little less time on the immune system, since we will also get a chance to visit that during our weekly lab, which is all about herd immunity. So that just gives you an idea of what to expect and what's on the pipeline. A couple of things that I do want to bring up before we get to that. And probably the most important thing, you've heard me mention it in the class, and I'm also going to make an announcement of that on the learning management system, is that all of the work up to date at that time, I'm asking you to make sure, if you've missed any assignments, if you've not scored as well in any of the assignments as you wanted, and you really want to tackle those again, the deadline for doing that and getting hold of me to get you set up to do that is at the end of the next week. So next week we are going to be taking our exam 2 and lab practical 2, which basically signifies that we're at the halfway point of the semester. And as we are approaching the halfway point of the semester, I think it's a really good time for us to tidy up our grade reports, make sure that we're really on top of where we should be, and if you're looking at your grades and wondering what the final grade might look like, well, for that reason, we need to also have anything that you haven't submitted cleared off from there. So all of that, I'm going to be asking that if you want anything redone, if you want anything submitted late and you haven't made a plan with me, do contact me. And all of that work is going to be due at the end of not this week, but next week, when the exam 2 and practical 2 are due. Because what I will do at that time, I will just put zeros to wherever you have not completed some work. This only affects a small group of students, but I do want to make sure that everyone has plenty of notice and plenty of chances to get this addressed. So if you have missed any work, or if your score on any work isn't where you expect it to be, well, this is time to get it rectified before I lock in those grades for the first half of the semester. So that's next week. So this is a good time to get tackling with those. The other thing that I do always want to highlight, we always discuss what are you expected to do in terms of the homework for this week. So you have, as always, the quiz covering the chapter material, and you have the practical or practice anatomy element as well to do. both of those are completed independently on the publisher's platform. So there is a live link and you use that. I heard recently, I think yesterday at afternoon, that there was some issue with the practical not loading for every student, or one student shared this with me. So I'm going to troubleshoot that immediately after this session. So if it's not running in just a few hours, it should be running. So I'll get that addressed. We will be completing also a lab this week, and this week's lab will complete it together in person, as we have been doing for the most of the labs. Last week was the only exception when you had the virtual lab to complete independently. So we will be completing this lab during our Thursday session, and it's going to be a simulation of herd immunity. So tying in nicely with the immune system, getting a little bit of more of a physiological, practical experience of seeing the population scale of immunity. How does immunity develop, and what factors do we need to meet to get a significant amount of immunity developed so that the entire population is protected. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to jump out of this. As always, if you have any questions, remember, I am here to answer those. It's really easy to get hold of me either in a class, during these weekly sessions that I offer, or in case you wish to talk one-on-one with me. I'm happy to make time before, after classes to meet in person, or we can even do that virtually. So you just let me know when. Never do I need to say to a student that I don't have time to meet with them. So I feel very lucky in that sense that I am able to facilitate those requests. So do not hesitate to get hold of me. What we're going to do, we're going to talk about the lymphatic system as the first system that I want us to look at. And before we really dive into the lymphatic system, what I did in a class, and if you were in a class with me, you've had a chance already to practice this a little bit, so it will be a nice review of that. We started by considering what would be the functions of the lymphatic system. And there's actually three main functions that I want us to know about, that I think are the most important ones to be aware of. And I think that two of these are fairly obvious ones, and the third one might require a little bit more discussing about. And that's why we're here today, that we have time to discuss through those until you feel definitely comfortable about all of those. Well, the first function of the lymphatic system really goes hand in hand with the immune system, all about protecting us. So we talked earlier on about how there can be many different kinds of risks for your health and your well-being, really. And usually these are some sort of outside invaders that come to your body that your body has to protect itself against. And we're just going to use a clump word or a general word, a pathogen, to describe any kind of foreign invader to your body. These can be viruses, these can be bacteria, these can be parasites, these can be many, many, many different kinds of things. But what our lymphatic system working with the immune system does is that it really gives us a way to fight against these pathogens. The second important function that goes especially with the lymphatic system is to manage our fluid balances. So far, and I'm going to come back to this slide in just a second, but so far what I've told you was that our cardiovascular system is this closed loop where we simply have a heart and then tubing that connects the heart from one end of the loop to another end. And within that tubing, driven by this heart, is where our blood flows. So it really shows that it's a one-directional flow, and it is a closed loop, so blood doesn't venture off from there. It just travels within this system. That's what I've told you so far. And I've said that there's a little bit more to the story, and we'll get to that. And today is the day when we get. It does turn out, however, that during the capillary filtration, where we had that exchange of the materials from these smallest of blood vessels of the cardiovascular system, some amount of fluids do escape the capillaries, and some amount of fluids do get picked up by the capillaries. And it turns out that this is not completely in balance. So the balance of this loss of some of the liquid from the cardiovascular system and some of the liquids building up outside the cardiovascular system, we have a lymphatic system. So lymphatic system, you can almost think of it as a drainage system for your cardiovascular system. So whatever sneaks out of there gets picked up by the lymphatic system. So it really helps us to deal with these transporting fluids so that the fluids don't end up building here to the capillary bed sides, that rather we are getting the fluids transported back to the cardiovascular system. And you'll see that we have a network of lymphatic vessels that connect to each other, and then they dump their contents to the subclavian. So that's the big point there. So first and second function, I think do make sense. So fighting against the pathogens, and I've got a few pictures, a few examples of that in a moment. We've talked about the transporting the fluids. And the third one is something that we often do not think about, but is an excellent example of how our body has adapted to a challenge and been able to overcome that. And those are the points that I find most exciting about anatomy and physiology. So let's have a look of that as well. And later on this course, we will actually get to talk quite a bit about digestive system, and we'll get to talk about the nutrition while we're addressing that. And at that time, what we will end up talking is that really the big function of the digestive system is to take food in, transport it, then break it small enough within the system that it's able to cross those plasma membranes from that tube, that's continuous tube inside you, which really isn't inside your body tissues, inside your body as such. So we're able to move the material from that tube to the body itself. And to cross that membrane, the food that we're consuming needs to be broken into small enough molecules so that they're able to do this crossing. Well, it turns out that dietary fats are often very large molecules, and they remain too large to be picked up by the cardiovascular system and even the capillaries of the cardiovascular system. And you remember that was really what we are trying to do. All the nutrients and all the energy, we want to pick that up by the blood supply to the intestinal region of our body. Well, what are we going to do if there's all this valuable dietary fat, but we're not able to pick it up? Well, what we have done and what we have found us a way to work around that is by recruiting our lymphatic system. So lymphatic system here is able to deal with much larger molecules than our cardiovascular system's capillaries. So lymphatic capillaries are able to pick up those large dietary fats, and they then transport those within the lymphatic system all the way there close to the heart at the subclavian, where it all gets dumped back or gets dumped into the cardiovascular system, into the blood. And in this way, we're actually able to get into our body, get to use those large dietary fat molecules that otherwise would go to waste. So that's a clever adaptation that our body has been able to use as a way to solve this challenge of large dietary fat molecules. So I'm talking of the fats that we get from the food, we get from our diet that are important for us. So those are going to be the three important main functions of our lymphatic system. And we will see this during this quick talk a few times again, but I do tend to think that it's a good way for us to start by understanding why do we need this system. So I think that that's why it's a nice way for us to approach this. So what other things should I share with you? Well, let's start with the clinical relevance of the lymphatic system. So if you've ever had an infection, you've gone to the doctor, one thing that you do end up noticing is that they try out your lymph nodes, seeing whether they are swollen. And lymph nodes are structures which house our white blood cells. So if you do have an infection, what your body does, it detects that, and the number of white blood cells in your body increases. Well, since the white blood cells are housed within the lymph nodes, the physical size of the lymph nodes increases. And we can just by this simple test of feeling out the lymph nodes tell if they're swollen, and especially if they're tender as well. You answer to the doctor, yeah, they feel sore when you touch them. We can tell there is an infection somewhere in the body going on. We might not know exactly where, but we know that it is there. So that's what the doctor is doing there and trying to find out. So it's our body's response to an infection that we're able to tell about. Even like I said, we don't know exactly where or what type of an infection, but we know that there is an infection of some kind if your lymph nodes are swollen and tender. So really simple test, but really gives us quite a bit of information. What we are going to do on this first part of our session where we review the lymphatic system, we're going to look at three different parts. And the three different parts that we'll have a look of are going to be the lymphatic vessels themselves. So we'll talk about the major vessels that make the lymphatic system. So there's some really important ones for us to know in terms of anatomy, but also kind of having a comparison with the cardiovascular system vessels. We'll also talk a little bit about the lymph. And lymph actually as a word comes from a Latin word lympha, and that means water. So that really gives us an idea that what we're going to be seeing is something liquidy. It's not quite as clear as water. It's this whitish substance, but that's where the word for the lymph comes from. And we'll talk finally about the lymph nodes. We'll spend a little more time on that to have an appreciation what lymph nodes are, what they do, and what you should know about those. So at large, that is an outline for our session today. And before we really dive too much further, I want to start from this picture that we've already quickly visited. So far we've understood that some of the fluid builds within this capillary region from the cardiovascular system, and some of that fluid we do need to deal with. We don't exactly have an answer, I think, that why that fluid was produced, other than that that's an important part of the filtration of the or exchange of the materials at the capillaries. So some material leaves, some comes in. So what we're going to do, we're going to really dig into this and look it in a greater detail. When we were talking about the chapter on our cardiovascular system, and especially looking at the blood vessels in a greater detail, where we finished off was me stating that we'll come back to this hydrostatic and osmotic pressure later on. And this is the time when we come back to it. So what we're seeing here, we're seeing a blood vessel. So we have a blood vessel which came from the heart, first as an artery and then an arteriole. And then turns into a capillary and goes back as a venule and then as a vein back to the heart. So the section that we're focusing on this diagram is going to be the capillary section of this blood vessel. What we see is the blood is flowing through it from one end to another end. And it was the capillaries where the exchange of materials took place. So that's something that we've talked about. That's going to be the important role of the capillaries. And for this exchange to happen, we need to get some material leaving the blood into the interstitial fluid. And in addition to the interstitial fluid, of course, we've got a bunch of cells here that we're exchanging this material with. So we want materials to be able to cross to the blood and out from the blood. And there's two forces that enable us to do this. So let's have a look of those. The first force that we're going to be talking about is going to be our hydrostatic force. Hydrostatic force, if you want to summarize it and keep it simple, that's the force that's responsible for pushing materials out of the blood, out of the blood vessel, into this interstitial space. So hydrostatic force is the driving force for the materials to leave the blood. There has to be a balancing force, of course, and this balancing force is going to be our osmotic pressure. So what osmotic pressure does, osmotic pressure is responsible for pushing materials back in to the blood. So osmotic pressure drives for the materials to return to the blood vessel. So at large, if these two forces were in balance, overall, some would leave capillary, but same amount would go back into the capillaries. And it is thanks to these two forces that we're able to exchange the gases, the nutrients, the waste products, and so on. from where they are to where they need to go at the capillary beds. So now we have the big picture. And let's have a look of this in a little bit more detail. We've already talked about how it is the blood that flows within this capillary blood vessel. And the name for the process of exchanging the materials thanks to this hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure is capillary filtration. So capillary filtration refers to this process of some of these fluids leaving, some of them returning back to the blood. So that's the name of the process. That's what we're focusing on. Well, what is that liquid then that's leaving the blood? Well, the liquid, that's the portion of the blood that's leaving, is really the same composition as the plasma. So that leaves the blood outside the capillaries, and that same liquid gets picked up back to the blood by the capillaries. When we are no longer talking about plasma, when it's in this interstitial space, we can also talk about interstitial fluid. It is the same thing. The composition is the same. The name just is different. Now we're referring to the fact that this fluid is located in this space between the cells in this area of a capillary network that we are looking at. So let's do a little bit of math and add some numbers to what's going on. It's about 20 liters of our hydrostatic, of fluids due to the hydrostatic pressure that leave the capillaries in a single day. About 20 liters, that's quite a lot if you think about it. But luckily, equally large portion of that fluid gets taken back due to the osmotic pressure, about 17 liters. Well, if you do any maths, and I had to write this down for myself just because I'm blonde, is that leaves us with 3 liters that should have been picked up back to the blood vessels, but hasn't been picked up back to the blood vessels, and then we have to deal with. So it is this 3 liters of extra interstitial fluid that we have been left with that we now face a challenge that we need to tackle with. Well, this 3 liters basically has the composition of the plasma, which is what we call the element once it's in the blood, or while it's in the blood as the element of the blood. Once that has left the blood vessels and is now in this interstitial space, we call it interstitial fluid. So we need to get rid of that somehow. And how we get rid of that is by treating it as lymph. So when interstitial fluid becomes then lymph, would make an excellent exam question. So I really think that it's important that I emphasize and preferably overemphasize rather than just take it for granted that we're talking of the same material here. The plasma of the blood, which then became interstitial fluid while it came into this space here from the blood. And when it gets picked up by the lymphatic system, this 3 liters per day, now we talk of it as lymph. So one of the questions that I do like to ask in an exam is in many different ways. It can be multiple choice question. It can be a short answer question. When does interstitial fluid become lymph? And the answer to that would be when it enters the lymphatic system. So when it enters the lymphatic vessels. So really, that's the explanation. That's the answer to us for when we're thinking that when does this become lymph? It becomes lymph when it moves into the system, the lymphatic system. Okay, I hope that that makes sense. The other thing that I think I've already alluded to and I've kind of addressed, but I haven't emphasized that, and I just want to make sure that for the sake of completedness, it does get emphasized. So if we run to the very first slide that I had here for this presentation, we have already talked about the cardiovascular system. And lymphatic system is tightly connected to that because you remember that cardiovascular system was closed one-way loop, but we are going to have some blood, some elements leaking out. We just talked about that. And that gets picked up by this lymphatic system, which you could think of almost as a drainage system, the complementary system for that. So these two are closely connected. So that's what I really wanted to just remind us when we're talking about that. But in addition to lymphatic system and cardiovascular system being closely connected, in addition, also lymphatic system and immune system are closely connected. You can think of the lymphatic system is something that we can see. We can actually find structures of the lymphatic system. So that's why it's kind of easier. It gives us the structural basis for understanding. But immune system is much more physiological system. So immune system instead is all about the functioning of the white blood cells, the cell responses to pathogens, and so on. It is much harder to visualize because it's all functional. It's a little bit more abstract. So you could think of it in a way that immune system is housed within the lymphatic system. So lymphatic system gives the space for the immune system to be located at and do its job. So I hope that that makes sense for why we are talking about these two systems as one specific learning module. I think that it's easiest to draw the connections. You know, I'm all about connections between body systems. And with these two, it's really hard to talk about one without another. So the structures where everything exists through the lymphatic system, immune system, then the physiological branch in terms of not really having structures on its own, but getting those structures from the lymphatic system. So I hope that that all makes sense at this point. And this brings us now to the point where we're next going to talk about these different types of vessels that make up the lymphatic system. And we will discuss through all of them at large and pick up some specific examples. One thing to notice is that when we were studying blood vessels, I told you that it would be a good idea if you get asked to write an essay or ever talk about them, talk them in the order in which the blood flow would go through the system. Same goes for the lymphatic vessels. We're going to start from this end here, where the interstitial fluid is picked up and becomes lymph as it enters to the lymphatic system. And then we will follow the path of this lymph on the lymphatic system. So really the direction will be from capillaries to larger and larger and larger lymphatic vessels until we get right next to the heart, to the subclavian vein where we dump the contents. So that's the plan for the next part. And we're going to start, of course, by talking about the capillaries. So lymphatic capillaries. They are very similar to what we have seen with the capillaries of the cardiovascular system. They are just as capillaries of the cardiovascular system, where they are very permeable. In fact, they are even more permeable than the cardiovascular system capillaries. They take up very large molecules, so larger even than what we saw with the cardiovascular system. And this is how these large dietary fat molecules, we could pick them up with our lymphatic vessels because they're able to handle these even larger molecules than what we have seen so far. So what I'm trying to highlight here, for example, the dietary fats that we talked about. So there's a lot of similarities between the cardiovascular capillaries. We end up finding those valves, the valve adaptation, as we move further to the larger lymphatic vessels, similarly to what we saw in the cardiovascular system. So next, what we're going to talk about the lymphatic vessels, a couple of examples of the important ones. So these are bigger than our capillaries, but not quite as large as trunks and ducts. And what we're seeing here is our chest cavity, thoracic cavity opened up. We're looking in, we're seeing back of the thoracic cavity. We have our heart removed from the view here. So this is where the heart would have been located. We have our superior vena cava, inferior vena cava. We have our esophagus, and then we would have our trachea here going to the lungs. It's just all opened up and cleared, so it's easier to see what's going. There are certain structures that I do want us to pick up from this diagram. So rather than looking blood vessels, now we're looking at lymphatic vessels, and you'll notice that there is this long vessel of thoracic duct that runs at the back of the thoracic cavity. So that's one anatomical structure that I do want you to be able to notice here. So our thoracic duct. At the end, lower end, the inferior end of the thoracic duct, there's an expansion of it, and this is known as our sternoculi. So another important anatomical landmark for us to know. So those were our most important vital vessels that I wanted to talk about. Now we are ready to move to something a little bigger. So we're going to be starting to talk about trunks. And I provided to you in the class, and if you were not in the class, it's also available on your Canvas handout with some of the important slides or important structures that I want you to know. And one of these is going to be these lymphatic trunks and collecting ducts that I want you to know. So it's an adaptation of what you're seeing here. So I want us to go through a few of the most important trunks, which ones you should know and be able to locate. If we were to get to that, get to do a little bit of a dissection. So let's start with the lumbar trunk. This clue here is the location of the structure. So the clue is in the name. So located at the lumbar region of your body, so lower back region. You'll notice there's large trunks of the lymphatic system located there. Another one would be intestinal trunk. So covering the intestines, especially important as we talked about the dietary fats and picking up those large molecules that our cardiovascular system couldn't pick up. I also want to mention intercostal trunk. So intercostal term referring between the ribs. So we have lymphatic trunks running also between the ribs. The next one is kind of a good example for us when we're thinking of the anatomical and physiological language or medical language, bronchomediastinal trunk. You might initially say that, oh, that's a lot, that's a big word, what do I get out of it? Break it in parts. So we have this trunk supplying the bronchi and the mediastinum. So this mediastinum was where the heart was located between the lungs, the space there. So that's supplied by a trunk of its own. So name referring to that. Another good trunk to know would be our subclavian trunk. So below the clavicle, below, and clavian referring to the clavicle, clavicle bone, your collarbone. What else could I pick up? I think a jugular trunk is one more that I do want to highlight here, so supplying the neck and throat region. So those would be very important lymphatic trunks for us to be able to locate and identify. And part of this course is being able to identify the structures at the right regions. Having talked about those, let's move on to even bigger of a scale. And we're going to be talking about the lymphatic ducts. And there's not that many of those that I want to highlight, but we can still use the same diagram that we saw earlier on. So let's start with the right lymphatic duct. So this drains the right arm and right side of the head and neck into the right subclavian vein. So this is where all of that gets dumped into a useful structure for us to know. And of course, then we're going to have also thoracic duct. Thoracic duct really drains the rest of the body to the left subclavian vein. So again, a structure that's going to be important for us to be able to identify and locate. Well, I guess that at this point, a logical question to ask would be that, okay, all is good, but what do we do if these don't work? If we are not now draining the lymph, these 3 liters of extra fluid that builds up successfully? Well, what you would be left with would be a swelling that's resulting from this lymph not being drained correctly. We talk about lymphedema. So remember, edema was some kind of a swelling. In this case, it's going to be due to the lymph. So this is where we have a return of the lymph failing. So this could be due to a tumor or the vessel itself being missing or removed or so on. Typically, this is localized only to one side of the body. So when you're trying to figure out, is this just the body shape of an individual or is this an actual edema, do have a look of that bilateral symmetry. Do we find the same on both sides or one side only? So I think that's what I wanted to say about that. Of course, this might improve a little bit over time by spontaneous improvement, lymphatic vessels, the lymphatic paths finding their way to drain these areas. But it is also possible that it does not improve, and then we need to start thinking about what other options we have. Having said all this, I think it's a great time for us to move along and have a look of the lymph a little bit. And I shared earlier on with you that really lymph stands for this Latin word lympha, referring to the water. Well, if we look at this test tube that we're seeing here, it really doesn't look that much like water in terms of the color. It is whiter, this kind of a milky, opaque color that, that lymph has. If we look at the composition, what the lymph is made of, we're seeing a lot of familiar stuff here. So we're seeing, of course, our water being the main portion, and we're seeing our proteins. We discussed how also the plasma of the blood contain proteins. And not surprisingly, of course, we see also salts, glucose, fats, all of these things that we saw within the plasma as well. The thing that we are seeing that we didn't have with the plasma is going to be, of course, our white blood cells. There's a rich number of white blood cells. They were the workhorse of our immune system. So when we are looking at lymph, we're expecting to see a lot of white blood cells present there. There is one thing, though, that we do not expect to see in the lymph. And if we see any of that in the lymph, that would be a cause for concern. That would be something that we would have to get a little concerned about. We do not want to see any red blood cells within our lymph. So that would be a problem. One more thing that I probably should say, and I want to add on this discussion that we had, is where lymph is made. Of course, we have our bone marrow. As a site where the lymph is made. And of course, then we have our lymph nodes. To note as well. In terms of the cells of the lymphatic system, the lymphoid cells, there are two that we could discuss. We're going to keep this section fairly light, just simply for the sake of time. You have full actual lecture videos available, like I said, on the canvas. So when we are talking about the lymphatic cells, the immune system cells, the two cells that are going to be worthy for us to notice are going to be our T cells. You remember T cells matured at the thymus, and B cells which matured at the bone marrow. So that's where the names come from, and we'll get into much more of a detail of these two cell types as we start to look at the immune system. But really, it is the T cells and B cells that are the workhorse of the immune system and the important cells there. We do have some supporting cells as well, such as the reticular cells of the that we could have a look of, but we are not going to go into that on this review session. So I'm just flagging them up and leaving them. If you're interested, there is plenty of more information in the full lecture material. We can also, when we're looking at lymphoid tissues, do a division into two types. This general tissue, general lymphoid tissue that we find everywhere in the body. So that's, again, another thing that we're not going to dive into too much of a detail. What we will spend our attention instead is talking about specialized lymphoid tissues. So this includes the lymph nodes, which we need to talk about, and also the lymphatic organs that we will quickly review on this session that we're on at now. So this is where we're going to be spending our resources getting familiar with. And I think we could start right away with our lymph nodes. So let's jump into there. So lymph nodes are these glands typically located as kind of these clusters. Someone once, when I was still a student and studying, described them to me almost like pearl necklaces. I don't really necessarily see that there, but if you have a good imagination, maybe you will see it better than I do. But what we see with the lymph nodes, they're clustered, they're great in numbers. We're talking anywhere from 400 to 700 in body, so in great numbers. Their role is really to filter and purify the lymph that flows through them. So the lymph flows through the lymph nodes. And what we end up noticing is that if we do have an inflammation, the white blood cells that normally are housed within these lymph nodes, well, the number of white blood cells increased, and as a result of that, also the lymph nodes themselves end up swelling. And we saw some really good pictures of that in the class of swollen lymph nodes, how they really are striking in their appearance. Lymph nodes are typically near to the surface, so they are kind of easy to spot in certain parts of the body. So that's why, again, the doctor might feel for them because they are so easily accessible. There are a few other places that you probably haven't thought where we can access lymph nodes, so let's go through those. And in addition to the obvious ones, I think that will be rather useful for us. So let's start with the cervical lymph nodes, so the neck region. We have a cluster of lymph nodes there. The other area where we typically easily find lymph nodes, they're very easy to palpate, is within our armpit, so our axillary lymph nodes. These can feel really sore if you have a nasty infection going on, so you can end up getting that achy feeling there as well. Another region where you would find lymph nodes, a cluster, is our supratrochlear lymph nodes. So remember our terminology for the bones of the elbow. So this is just above the trochlear notch. So referring to that area. Of course, our inguinal lymph nodes. So at the groin area, there's a bunch of lymph nodes easily accessible there. We just don't really use that in clinical practice as much for obvious reasons. We have our abdominal lymph nodes and our thoracic lymph nodes at the thoracic cavity. So that's where we find these lymph nodes. Like I said, we find them often in clusters. So some of the good areas, obvious areas to look for. When we talk about lymph nodes themselves, we've already talked a little bit about them. They are small, rounded structures. Some describe them to me as looking a little bit like beans. And I can kind of see that. I can see what you're meaning. In terms of their size, they're usually less than 2.5, 2.5 centimeters in size. For those of you who are not from the metric system, approximately maximum of an inch in size. One thing to notice is that the lymph nodes, they are enclosed inside a capsule, so fibrous tissue capsule that surrounds them. And we end up finding two regions of a lymph node as well. So the outer cortex and the inner medulla. And here I have a really beautiful stained tissue sample. You can see the two portions really standing out quite nicely there. Within the medulla, I did also include the term sinus. So we find sinuses there. And if you remember, we've talked about sinuses before. These were any empty spaces within the body, within the structures. So we end up finding sinuses also within the lymph nodes. A couple of vessels that I want to talk as they relate to the lymph nodes. So I want to talk first of all about our afferent vessels. So these are the vessels that bring the lymph into the lymph node. So if you need a mnemonic to remember that afferent arriving, then the lymph travels through the lymph node and leaves through the efferent lymphatic vessels. Efferent, you can think of it for exit. So lymph flows through the lymph node in this kind of a more predictable pattern of directions. And so that was the important role you remember for the lymph to get screened. White blood cells were housed within the lymph nodes. So lymph nodes do that job for us. Let's add a little bit of a clinical relevance to this. So we talked about if your lymph glands are inflamed, they're swollen, they might feel a little sensitive. All of that is a sign that there is probably an inflammation going on. A lack of pain would not be definite diagnostic criteria, but it would be a concern if we do not see some sensitivity on clearly inflamed lymph nodes. We've discussed earlier on the class that you really should not use the word pus when you're doing medical records and describing, for example, a wound. We discussed the importance of that earlier on, so I will not go into that at this time. What we've got left to look at is really to go through the lymphatic organs. And there's 5 that I'm going to highlight in particular. I think it's going to be important for us that we've spent at least a little bit of time going through those. I know there's always a lot of material, and it's a kind of we have to choose what we focus on. But even in the class, yesterday, we did try to make a little bit of time to go through these important lymphatic organs. So let's do that on this review session as well. So we're going to start with spleen. And many times students don't really end up having to speak a lot about spleen, learn a lot about spleen, but it is an important structure. Approximately size of your fist, located on the left side of the abdominal cavity, just below the stomach. Kind of peeking out there on this diagram. Screen is getting a little sensitive and getting a little bit of a ghost marking, so let's just try to tidy that up again. This is in fact the largest lymphatic organ that we have in our body and serves many purposes. What's noteworthy is that there's a rich blood supply to the spleen through the splenic artery. So when we looked at the major blood vessels and we had different groups preparing diagrams of those, I would be interested to see if the group that focused on the abdominal region also had a chance to add the splenic artery on their diagram. The functions of the spleen filters, cleans the blood, removes old blood cells, the dead blood cells, platelets, and so on and so on. Also responsible for storing iron and platelets, so we can reuse when we need to some of these structures. Probably an important point that I want to highlight is that that in an embryo, this is where the red blood cells are produced. So during our early life, early development, spleen plays a major role as the production site for our red blood cells. In terms of the damage to the spleen, it is possible that if there is a rupture, we have to remove it. We talk about splenectomy, but at large, spleen is really good at having ability to repair itself and fix itself. So that is not as much of a problem, really, for us in general. Let's have a look of tonsils, the next structure, a little bit. And it's not that we only have one set of tonsils. We have many different kinds of tonsils at different parts. So we're going to go through those a little bit. They are named on their location. So Palatine Tonsils, located at the posterior oral cavity, are lingual tonsils at the base of the tongue, pharyngeal tonsils, the posterior nasopharynx, and tentubal tonsils, where the auditory tube opens up. So many different kinds of tonsils located at many different locations. Of course, many of us know someone, or might ourselves even have had our tonsils inflamed. They can grow extremely large. Here we see a kind of a striking picture showing the enlarged tonsils on both sides of the uvula. And tonsillitis is the term that refers, you remember itis, an inflammation of something. In this case, it's going to be tonsils, so inflammation of the tonsils. Typically in the past, we tended to remove tonsils fairly easily if there were repeated cases of tonsillitis, especially on younger patients. We found that that was a good solution. Now we're moving a little bit more conservative about doing that. We know that tonsils are an important part of the lymphatic and immune system, so we're asking, should we really be removing this tissue that might serve a purpose that we don't even fully yet understand? So we are a little less inclined to remove the tonsils these days. Of course, if we have issues with breathing, swallowing, we do want to keep the airway secure. That is a priority over preserving something that we don't fully understand, fully know. Let's talk a little bit about the appendix. That's the first part of your large intestines. So when we look at the small intestines and then move on to the large intestines before talking about cecum and colon, we see the very first part was the appendix. We often talk in a class that why do we have appendix? It's this little hanging thing there. What's the purpose of that? And the truth is that we don't have a definite answer. What we are speculating and what seems to be the best accepted theory at the moment is that it is an evolutionary remain from when we needed to house bacteria that was adjusted better for digesting plant-based diet. So remember, we have not always been eating as a species as much meat as we do these days. And any animals that eat a highly plant-based diet, they do need to have specific bacteria to digest that. Think of cows, they have multiple stomach diseases, they end up vomiting the food back a few times so that they can really digest that plant-based food. So similarly, that might have been where we were storing the bacteria for this purpose. Of course, your appendix can get inflamed and we remove that and you can live just fine without it. So do we know what the appendix does and what's the purpose of it? I would go as far as arguing that we're not quite sure yet. And we're probably going to get more insight to this as time passes and more research is conducted. So there is, again, a little bit of a change in the approach that we are becoming a little bit more conservative about removing the appendix because we just don't know yet. So there might be value in keeping it. Thymus is a structure that we've talked already before, located at the inferior neck, made of 2 lobes. This was the site where the T cells matured at, large in infants, and then also in your puberty. So if you look at these sizes of them and consider the body size of the individual, especially at birth, extremely large, but shrinks, gets replaced by connective tissue, adipose tissue, as you age, so harder to find in older people. Still functional though, still serves an important role. So we've talked about thymus a little bit before, so I'll just leave it at that. I do want to mention, for the sake of completedness, also Peyer's patches. These are a little bit like tonsils located at the distal portions of the small intestine's wall, and they play a role in destroying bacteria and serving as memory lymphocytes. So again, something where a lot more information is being gathered and we're learning about more. And that brings me to the conclusion of what I wanted to share with you when we talk about the lymphatic system. Should talk a little bit about the immune system. So I think what we're going to do at this point, we're going to wrap this up and we're going to just take a quick breather moment, and then we'll have a look of some of the key points as they relate to the immune system. We will not get a chance to go into a great amount of detail, and I do think that we are very lucky that we're going to be doing the immune system lab. That gives us a great chance to revise some of the key points from there. But I do also want to, at least for the sake of having done my job, talk a little bit about them today. So if you need a quick break, this is a good chance to take it, and we will continue in just a momentarily to have a look of the look of the key points of the immune system. So, immune system is really made of two parts, made of our lymphatic system, and we have, of course, our white blood cells that play a especially important role in our immune responses and parts of the immune system. I introduced earlier on the word pathogen, coming from Greek word for pathos. So really any invader that enters the body that shouldn't be there. We see a great variety, everything from viruses, from bacteria, to parasites, to fungi, and so on. So there's many different kinds of pathogens that we might have. So it is our immune system that helps us to deal with these invaders. And when we talk about the immune system, we really are faced of talking really about two branches of it, or two systems of their own. So we're going to start by talking about the innate immune system. This is very general in nature, very non-specific in responses. So we'll start with that. It protects us against many different kinds of pathogens. Then we'll move our focus on the adaptive immune system, which is really what we think of when we talk about immunity as such, as something that you faced a thing before and second time around you're better geared to deal with that. In British English-speaking world, we probably prefer to use the term also acquired when we discuss about adaptive branch of the immune system. I think the acquired really summarizes the nature of the system really well. So you meet something, you develop a response, second time you meet it, you already have that acquired response against that. So the adaptive branch targets only specific antigens, and that's really where the white blood cells become very important. We'll talk about that, white blood cells carrying a memory, if you wish. But like I said, let's start with our innate immunity. That's what we're going to be focusing first. So innate immunity was our general non-specific protecting against many different types of pathogens. And it works through different lines of defense. And let's start with the first line of defense, which would be having some sort of a physical barrier against these pathogens. So if you think about a major barrier, it's of course going to be our skin. So that keeps what's supposed to be inside, and other things what are supposed to be outside. So skin is an excellent physical barrier, keeping away the what shouldn't be able to enter into our body. Of course, if you have a cut in the skin, that's a direct route for inflammation, for pathogens to enter into your body. So that would be a concern. So one way we discuss this when I discuss it with students, the physical barrier nature of the innate defense system is, if you think of old medieval castle, it is these walls of the fortress that really keep the trouble from even getting in the first place. If the trouble never gets in, we don't have to deal with it. So that might be the smartest way of just keep the pathogens away. So that's what I mean when I talk about the first line of defense being the physical barriers. Of course, rather than just having the skin, we have many openings in our body, and those openings, whether it's a digestive tract coming from downstairs to go into the lungs, wherever, but we end up noticing they're lined with mucous membrane. So mucous membrane is another one in addition to the skin that's very good at forming this layer. This is a little more moist layer, keeping things away from entering to the body. Well, that's not the only line of defense, though. Let's have a second look of the second line of defense. We're going to be looking at many chemical barriers that we can form. So just like we had the skin barrier, we're also able to form chemical responses to prevent these pathogens from entering into our body. So sweat is excellent at killing pathogens, keeping them away, is cleaning the skin. So some amount of sweat is needed. And not just to lubricate the skin, but really to work against these pathogens. Of course, if you think we end up eating, swallowing sometimes stuff that we shouldn't, so stomach acid kills anything that gets to the stomach that shouldn't quite be there. So another excellent chemical barrier in that sense. Our eyes are very vulnerable route of entry for many pathogens, so tears serve a perfect role in that, preventing them from getting in. When we think of UTIs, for example, we notice that the female urethra is much longer, so there's much longer of a way for pathogens to, or female urethra is shorter, so there is not as long of a way for pathogens to get into the body, cause issues, as with males, where we have a little bit of, we're lucked out with a little bit of a longer urethra, so UTIs are less common on males simply because of this distance for the pathogens to travel. However, we are using, if you think of it in that way, urine is sterile liquid. We're using that as a way of dealing with these pathogens, invaders, washing them away from the urethra. So something to keep on mind on there. I also do not want to forget that we have many different kinds of cell responses, so further lines of defense, if you wish, to deal with potential pathogens that crossed over those physical barriers, chemical barriers. We can, on a cellular level, on the innate immune system, also deal with those. I do want to take a couple of moments to talk about inflammation. So inflammation is always a response to an injury. So it's how our body responds to injury, and the injury can be many different kinds. There are 4 or 5, depending on which classification you use, signs and symptoms of inflammation. And I would like you to be able to identify those. I have a couple of pictures there on the left-hand side that are rather good at illustrating an inflammation. So I hope that that will help you to spot some of these that are more obvious ones. So let's work through these 5 signs and symptoms of an inflammation. First of all, the site that's inflamed typically tends to be red in color. This is because of increased blood flow to the site. So remember, the red color of the skin is, we're seeing some of the blood through. If there is an injury, we want a lot of blood flow there so that the white blood cells also reach there. So increased blood flow there. Same goes for the heat. These sites of inflammation tend to feel a little warmer. Think of that rich amount of blood coming from the core in great numbers, great amounts. So there is definitely some heat that we can feel there. If you think again, increased greater amount of blood flowing to the site, including white blood cells, the site itself is getting packed. So there is swelling at the site of inflammation typically, especially on those toes, it's showing up quite nicely. Of course, all of this causes the swelling a little discomfort, but the other thing is that we do have pain on the site. And if you think, why would you get inflamed site painful and why would that be beneficial? It might make sense in a sense that we don't want to be using that site. We want to give it time to recover. First of all, that site might not function properly, but we also don't want the resources to be wasted now on using that site. Let's just let it recover, get better. So pain might be a useful way of limiting the stress on that side. Final thing that I wanted to talk about, and this is sometimes included, sometimes not, typically inflamed sites, there's a impaired functions. There's limited amount of motion, limited amount of function on these sides. So I think it's worth of noting we cannot trust an inflamed site to function quite as well, so it might be beneficial that we limit the amount of movement, the amount of that there. We also don't want to put more stress, more use on that site. We want to give it time to recover. So really, when we look at these signs and symptoms of inflammation, that's already starting to give us an answer to what I was going to ask from you, that is inflammation beneficial or not? Well, what we notice with inflammation is that it does actually help us to deal with many of these challenges that we're facing. So inflammation stops the spreading of the infection on that side or spreading of the situation, helps us with the process of removing pathogens from the site, either directly or by making the conditions ideal for the white blood cells to remove the pathogens, and also for the repair processes to take place. And of course, inflammation also works as kind of an alert for the immune system that there is now something that we need to deal with. So definitely beneficial, definitely many ways in which inflammation is beneficial for the recovery process. So we these days tend to take a lot of medication really easily. And when people get inflammation, we sometimes have recently started questioning, is it good that we try to suppress these signs and symptoms? Would it be better that you get a chance for your body to go through that healing process rather than we stopping them? So would that actually be counterintuitive in that sense? Another thing that I do want to talk with you guys is about fever. When we talk about fever, fever is abnormally high body temperature. So what's happening there? So let's have a look of that. And when we talk about fever, one of the things that we need to consider, is it ever good to have abnormally high body temperature? And sorry about that. Again, my screen is getting very sensitive these days. So high fever doesn't feel nice. It's not very comfortable. We've all had fever sometime. And the other danger with high fever is that if the fever is very high, you might also end up damaging or destroying some of the important enzymes that we have in the body. So any fever that gets closer to 40 Celsius degrees or higher, we do need to bring down that fever. That can start causing damages to, for example, to enzymes that we need. So that would not be good. We need to keep the fever within manageable scale. So fever doesn't feel great, doesn't necessarily, there is a limit how much fever we might have, but is there ever a time when fever would be beneficial? Would that ever be justified? It turns out that fever plays many positive roles in dealing with things that can be going on. For example, a little higher temperature helps us to inhibit the microbial growth. So the temperature is not ideal for microbes to grow anymore in our body if it's a little higher of a temperature. So it might be a clever way to stop the microbial growth from having the ideal conditions. Also, the site that has fever, if the fever is localized or even if it's a global fever in our body, a little high air temperature meant that chemical reactions happen at a little higher rate. So metabolic reactions, all of the chemical reactions taking place in the body at a little faster rate when there is a little bit of a higher body temperature. And of course, the phagocytosis, the killing of the pathogens, getting rid of them, engulfing them, removing them, that also is increased in a higher temperature. So having discussed all that, how do you feel now? Could fever be beneficial? And there are certain people, certain groups of people, including my native folks, we do try to generate an artificial fever when we feel that that might be useful by having a sauna. So just something to consider. So now that we've talked about this innate immunity in quite a bit of detail, we should move on definitely to address also the adaptive immunity or the acquired immunity, as I said, that we prefer to call it in British-speaking part of the world. And this really is a busy area. There's a lot to talk about, so I will not go into great detail about everything, but I do think that for the sake of completeness, we definitely need to mention it, and then you can fill in the story with any missing details once you look at the full lecture videos. Two types of cells that are going to be really important when we start talking about adaptive immunity are B cells and T cells. So we're going to talk about that. And let me just jump back in. I didn't mean to. The screen was getting a little small. I clicked something that I didn't mean to. So remember, this is a strong and very targeted response that we get with the adaptive immune system. It's very, very specific. It's very targeted, the response that we get to a challenge with this branch of the immune system. It also is available throughout the entire body. But really, the challenge for our adaptive immunity is that we need to have developed a memory against the pathogen. So we must have met that pathogen before. So it takes a little bit of time. It's not the ideal system on the first time when you face a pathogen, but then on the second time, it definitely is useful. But for the adaptive immunity to work optimally, we must have met that pathogen before. A couple of terms that we need to be, and I have provided actually, before I go to the terms, I have provided this handout to you on your learning materials on the learning management system, comparing the two branches of adaptive immunity, our cell-mediated immunity and humoral immunity with each other. So I encourage you to take a little bit of time looking through that, and maybe the lecture video on that as well might be useful. A couple of terms that I really do want to talk, that we're clear of what we're talking. And I recall that we touched upon this when we talked about the red blood cells and blood typing, all of those rejection processes. If the typing is not correct, the match is not correct. So I want to talk first of all about antigens. These are the foreign substances, the pathogens that enter to our body. So the foreign invader, if you wish, that shouldn't be, that tries to break into the body. And then I do want to talk about antibodies. These were responsible for protecting and acting on these pathogens. So they survey and act if something gets to the body that shouldn't. I have shown both visually here as well, kind of a sketch of both. And what I wanted to show is this key and lock appearance of these. So something to keep in mind. So they need to be a match. The antigen and antibody need to match well for them to actually trigger a reaction. There are actually many other shapes than just this Y shape that you typically tend to see on the textbooks. Our textbook I think does a good job of simplifying, showing that this would be the shape of a typical antibody, but there are other kinds. I've shown some of those here in addition to this one that we typically see. So do not think that all of them, all of our antibodies are of this appearance. There are other kinds. And in terms of when we talk about B cells, T cells, like I said, I have a full lecture video going into greater detail. We've touched upon those a little bit earlier on. So what I want to focus at this slide is to talk about these antigen presenting cells. We also have cells that don't deal with the pathogens themselves, but they catch them and they show them to the immune system so that the immune system can deal with them. So you can think of them a little bit as helpers in the immune system. So they allow us to identify an antigen that shouldn't be there and make it available for the immune system to deal with. So they present these for the immune system to act on. I do want to quickly discuss comparing the first time that we face an exposure to an pathogen versus when we do it for the second time. When we are talking especially about this specific adaptive branch of the immune system. Well, the first encounter with the antigen is it takes a little longer for us to act. We're talking about days rather in terms of it causing a reaction and the reaction being the worst that we get. And also the effect, the amount of immunoglobulins that we produce in response to that is quite limited. However, if we meet this pathogen for the second time, we have met it before, we have developed this immunological memory, if you wish. When we meet it for the second time, the response is much faster. Rather than talking about days, we're talking about hours in terms of that response. And that response is really strong as well. So it's much more effective. The downside was that we needed to have met that pathogen before. We needed to have developed this immunological memory on how to deal with it. And this memory can last from weeks, months to years. Think of the vaccines that we're talking a lot about these days. Think of the global pandemic with COVID. We're talking that you develop a secondary immune response against it, either naturally by having had the COVID or by having received a vaccine against it. I think this visual illustration of the difference between primary response and secondary response is really striking. So we have time going on there, and we have the concentration of antibodies in your body. It's an exponential scale, so do notice that when you're looking at that. So the first response, if you look where the exposure happens versus the reaction time, it takes much longer than on the second time. So we're talking about days for the reaction, whereas within second exposure, it's about hours. Also, the scale of the response, you'll notice how the response is so much larger on the second time. So that's striking to me as well. Take away, if nothing else, take that away when we're talking about the specific adaptive immune system in terms of the primary and secondary responses. This brings us to talk a little bit about organ transplants. So organ transplants is when we take the organ and remove it and place it to the recipient. So this can be either a transplant that we take from the same person who's going to receive it. A good example, so maybe from a different part, a good example of that, these autografts would be, for example, skin transplants. If you have skin damaged burns and so on, we can harvest that skin from another part of your body and move it where we need skin, where we don't have it. It can be also same species. So you can have a human donor that donates to another human. We do try to have a lot of matching there so that it would be as good of a match as possible. And that was the important part that we discussed earlier on. It can be also a different species in xenografts. For example, we use pig heart valves, transplant those to humans all the time, and so on. There's again the matching challenge that we need to look at when we do that. I guess that a good question that I like speaking with my students is that which are most common transplants that we do these days? This data is a little old, but the numbers at large are the same. So most common transplants probably in the States, kidneys, because we have two, it's kind of an easy to donate one and it's fairly common and it's not causing trouble for the donor either. A liver, for fairly similar reasons, liver has an amazing capacity of regenerating. So if you donate even half of your liver, you will soon enough within a year or so have functional liver that has regenerated, replaced what you donated away. So those are really easy in terms of getting donors, and we have quite good success with those. The next two ones, not so much because it's easy. We don't have spare hearts, we don't have spare lungs, but you can't really live without heart or lungs. So that's the reason why we end up doing transplants on those. So they're really, really important. Sometimes heart and lungs are also transplanted together as a bundle. I guess the good question here then would be that, well, how successful are our organ transplants? The survival changes over time. So initially highly successful, within 10 years or so, only about 50% of the patients are still around. So the survival rate decreases as we get older, as we age. You notice that certain transplants have much lower survival rates than others. So that's something to keep in mind as well. The problem that comes with the organ transplants is that we must somehow suppress the immune system of the recipient so that they don't end up rejecting the organ transplant. And this is really an issue for us because this is what becomes the leading cause of death for organ transplant recipients, that they become very vulnerable and can't protect themselves against normal bacterial and viral infections either. So if you are sick and you have someone you would want to go and see who has received an organ transplant, please don't. If it's a bacterial or viral infection, that can be lethal for these recipients. So their immune system is not able to deal with that. Finally, I have just listed for my own notes that I would make sure you discuss some of the conditions with the students. So there are many conditions that relate to the impaired function or production of the immune system cells. And many of these are interesting, are worth of looking into. I'm going to leave that for you for independent study, though. I'm just going to mention we have our Hodgkin's disease, dealing mainly with cancer of B cells. Of course, our HIV/AIDS. In this, the helper T cell activity is impaired. Usually, the main cause of death is not the HIV/AIDS itself. It is the infections that other infections that end up being lethal. We call them opportunistic infections. So that's something to bear in mind. Sometimes your immune system does lose ability to distinguish itself from others. So we have a bunch of autoimmune diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis, MS, myasthenia gravis, Graves' disease, type 1 diabetes, lupus, and so on. So we do need to have an immune system, but it needs to function also appropriately. So it's a balancing act there. We can also have immune responses to a threat that's really not a threat, but the response is so over the top that it causes us issues. We are hypersensitive to things such as allergies, for example, or you can go into anaphylactic shock even. So the response to something that's normal, your body thinks that it is not normal and starts to tackle that in an extreme way. So that really covers everything. I know it's been a lot of material to go through in terms of the lecture. I really feel strongly that once we get to talk about the our lab, it will all make a little bit more sense. So there's a lot to through, but that probably is gonna be the easiest or help us to tackle. I want to jump back to just remind you of the assignments for this week. We do complete the herd immunity lab in the class together. It is a simulation lab, so if you're not able to make it there, you can complete the simulation at home. But as always, I do try to make it worth your time to show up to the class. So we do have in the class a little bit of we go through the questions together and so on. So I try to make it so that it pays off for you to attend there. As always, if you have any questions at all, that is part of my job, a part that I really enjoy answering. So don't hesitate to just shoot me a message. Canvas is the quickest way of getting hold of me. Also, I'll make the time before, after classes, or even another time if you want. And also, I do want to encourage you, remind you that we are definitely able to meet remotely if you do want to, if you feel that that would be beneficial and helpful. On that note, this really summarizes, I know we ran a little longer than I had intended. This summarizes everything that we need to talk about in terms of the lecture material of this week. So some of this will be a revision once we get to the actual lab tomorrow. And until that, I hope you have a very good rest of the day and rest of the week, and I'll see you then. Thank you for joining me again.